The psychology of the hated child is one of the most complex and quietly devastating formations in human development, not because the child consciously understands what is happening, but because their mind learns to adapt to an emotional climate that denies them acceptance, warmth, or a sense of belonging. A child who grows up feeling unwanted or treated as a burden internalizes messages long before they can articulate them, and these messages become the earliest architecture of the self. They do not simply learn that affection is scarce, they learn that they themselves are the reason for its absence. As the mind develops, this emotional environment begins to shape their expectations of relationships, their sense of worth, their reaction to conflict, and the way they interpret the intentions of others. The child learns to navigate life through a mixture of hypervigilance, self-protection, premature maturity, and an internal world filled with questions that never had the space to become answers. Such a child often becomes extremely attuned to the moods of others. Instead of experiencing childhood as a period of exploration and expression, they experience it as a field of careful observation. They learn to read expressions, tones, silences, and small shifts in behavior with a level of sensitivity far beyond their years. This hyper-awareness is not a gift, it is an adaptation. It develops because the child's environment requires constant scanning for emotional safety. Over time, this creates an adult who can sense tension instantly, who notices what others overlook, and who anticipates conflict before it arrives. But beneath that talent lies a deep fear, the fear of being the cause of disappointment, irritation, or rejection. Another layer of the psychology of the hated child lies in identity formation. Children build their identity through the reflections they receive from caregivers and important figures. When those reflections are cold, inconsistent, or rejecting, the child internalizes a distorted mirror. They begin to believe that there is something fundamentally wrong with them, something inherently unlovable or inadequate. This belief does not remain confined to childhood. It evolves into a persistent internal narrative that influences adult relationships, self-expectations, and emotional boundaries. The person may grow into someone who constantly strives to prove their value, someone who feels uneasy when treated kindly, or someone who cannot fully accept praise because deep down they still believe that affection is conditional and fragile. Emotionally, the hated child often develops two contrasting tendencies. On one side, there is emotional restraint. They learn not to express too much, not to ask for too much, not to need too much. They fear that expressing genuine emotion will attract criticism or withdrawal. On the other side, they may harbor a quiet intensity of feeling, because emotions that are suppressed do not disappear. They gather strength in the internal world, shaping the child's inner dialogue. This tension between emotional silence and emotional depth creates adults who appear calm or detached on the outside, but carry enormous emotional sensitivity within. They learn to survive by being careful, but they feel deeply, even when they do not show it. Another psychological dimension lies in the coping mechanisms that these children develop. Some turn inward, becoming introspective, imaginative, or intellectually driven. The internal world becomes a refuge, a place where they can exist without judgment. Others develop a pattern of self-reliance, not out of confidence, but out of necessity. They learn early that depending on others may lead to disappointment, so they build autonomy prematurely. This creates adults who are capable, disciplined, and resilient, yet who struggle to accept help or vulnerability. The independence that others admire is often the result of years of emotional scarcity, where the child had no choice but to handle their feelings alone. There is also the psychological imprint of comparison. A hated or rejected child is often compared to others, siblings, peers, imagined ideals. These comparisons plant the seed of chronic self-measurement. The child learns to evaluate themselves constantly, to wonder why others are treated differently, and to internalize the belief that they fall short.
As adults, they continue this pattern, measuring their worth against standards that feel perpetually out of reach. They become perfectionistic, overly self-critical, or quietly insecure even when they perform exceptionally well. They may achieve much, yet feel little, because the inner narrative that formed in childhood continues to whisper that their value is conditional.
Relationships in adulthood reveal another profound influence. People who grew up feeling disliked often struggle to believe in the stability of affection. They may doubt compliments, question kindness, or assume that love is temporary. They enter relationships with caution, fearing that showing too much of themselves will lead to disappointment or withdrawal, just as it did in childhood. At the same time, they may overgive, over-apologize, or over-adjust to avoid conflict. This creates relational patterns where they either hold back too much or give too much, rarely finding a balanced middle. They may unconsciously gravitate toward relationships that echo their childhood dynamic, not because they want to, but because the familiar feels safer than the unknown. Another psychological impact is the development of existential loneliness. The hated child grows up with an internal sense of being on the outside affection, outside belonging, outside emotional safety. Even in adulthood, this feeling can persist, a quiet sense that connection is possible but not entirely secure, that the world can be close but not fully reached. This loneliness is not about physical isolation, it is about the lingering belief that one's inner self is not fully welcome. The person may build friendships, succeed professionally, and even maintain loving relationships, yet still feel a subtle emotional distance that originated long before adulthood. Yet, despite all of this, many individuals who grow from such childhood experiences develop extraordinary psychological strengths. Because they spent years understanding emotional complexity, they often develop deep empathy, profound insight, and the ability to perceive unspoken feelings in others. They become supportive friends, thoughtful thinkers, and emotionally intelligent adults, not because their childhood was easy, but because navigating it required a level of sensitivity and awareness that later becomes a powerful tool. Their resilience is not loud, it is quiet, steady, built through years of emotional endurance. Their strength lies not in hardness, but in the ability to feel deeply without collapsing. However, the most important aspect of the psychology of the hated child is the possibility of transformation. Although early emotional experiences leave deep impressions, the mind remains capable of rewriting internal narratives. Through awareness, reflection, supportive relationships, and time, individuals can begin to see themselves not through the lens of childhood rejection, but through their own conscious self-understanding. They can learn that emotional scarcity in childhood does not define their worth, that affection withheld was not proof of deficiency, and that their identity does not have to be determined by the reflections they were given. Transformation does not erase the past, but it reshapes the meaning of it, allowing the adult to reclaim the sense of worth that the child never received. In the end, the psychology of the hated child reveals a paradox. From early experiences of rejection can emerge some of the most perceptive, compassionate, and emotionally intelligent individuals. Their wounds become sources of reflection, their sensitivities become strengths, and their quiet resilience becomes the foundation for a life lived with depth and awareness. Understanding this psychology is not about dwelling on the past, but about illuminating how early emotional climates shape the inner life, and how, with awareness, the adult self can rise far beyond the identity the child was once forced to carry.